I booked the Airbnb because I needed a break from everything: work, traffic, the city noise. I didn't want to stay in a hotel surrounded by people. I wanted space, quiet, somewhere to breathe. The place I found looked perfect in the photos. A small cabin-style house on the edge of a lake, about 3 hours from the city. It looked clean, simple, nothing fancy. Wood floors, a deck overlooking the water, and a small dirt road leading up from the main highway. The reviews were few but positive. I left early in the morning, stopped for gas, and grabbed coffee along the way. The drive became more isolated as I got closer. The last 40 minutes were through forested roads. No cell service, no houses, just tall trees closing in on both sides. When I finally saw the turn for the Airbnb, it was a narrow gravel road with a small wooden sign nailed to a tree that said, Lakeview. The driveway was rough and long, full of ruts and stones. When I pulled up, I noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just still air and the ticking of my car's engine cooling down. The cabin was small, made of old timber but looked well maintained. There was a deck on the side that faced the lake. The water looked calm and flat, reflecting the dull gray sky. Inside, the place smelled faintly of wood polish and something older underneath it, maybe mildew or dampness from the lake. There was a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, a couch, a bathroom, and 1 bedroom. The walls were bare except for a clock that didn't work and a small framed photo of the lake. The air felt slightly heavy, maybe because the windows were shut tight. I unpacked my things and opened the windows to let air in. The lake stretched out quiet and wide, surrounded by dense trees on the far side. I didn't see any other houses or boats. Felt completely isolated. The first day passed quietly. I walked along the lake's edge and noticed faint footprints in the mud near the shore. They weren't fresh but still visible, leading from the trees to the water, probably from a fisherman or the last guest. I didn't think much about it. That night, I made dinner and sat outside on the deck. The air was cold but still. I could hear the faint creaks of the wooden boards beneath the cabin as the temperature dropped. When I went to bed later, it was so silent that I could hear my own heartbeat in the pillow. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. Took me a moment to realize what had woken me. It was faint, almost nothing, but it was there. A soft, steady tapping. Not rhythmic, but irregular. I lay still, listening. It sounded like it was coming from outside, maybe from the deck or near the window. I told myself it could have been a branch or something falling from a tree. But the tapping had weight to it, not the light sound of a stick. After a few minutes, it stopped. I eventually fell back asleep, but it took a while. In the morning, I checked outside. The deck was empty. I walked down toward the shore. The mud near the water had new prints, clearer this time, like someone had stood there recently. I couldn't tell how fresh, but they were sharper than the old ones I'd seen the day before. I looked around the tree line, but everything was still. I told myself it must have been a local who came by at night, maybe to fish. Still, something about it felt strange. Later that day, I explored a trail that led around the lake. The forest was dense, and the ground was soft with leaves. About halfway around, I came across a small clearing with an old, rusted metal barrel and a few crushed cans nearby. It looked abandoned, maybe used by hunters years ago. But there was something else, a tarp folded near the trees. It looked new, out of place in the middle of all that old debris. I didn't touch it. I just made a note of where it was and walked back before it got dark. That evening, I sat on the deck again, watching the lake. The water had turned darker, the air cooler. I could hear faint rustling in the trees across the water, but it was too far to see clearly. I closed the door early that night and double-checked the locks. I woke up again around 3 a.m. This time, the sound was clearer. Slow, heavy steps on the deck, wood creaking under weight. I froze, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped near the door. There was no light outside, so I couldn't see through the window. I stayed still, barely breathing. After maybe a full minute, the sound faded again, slow, deliberate steps moving away toward the side of the cabin. When I finally fell asleep, it was near dawn. I woke up to sunlight and went straight to the door. The deck boards had faint dirt smudges, like the outline of shoes. I looked closer. They were the same size and shape as the prints near the lake. I decided I would leave the next day. I had already paid for 2 more nights, but I didn't care. Something about the place felt wrong. Not in a haunted way, just in a quiet, real way. Like someone had been here before me and maybe never left. That day, I stayed mostly inside. I didn't feel comfortable walking far. Around evening, I noticed something strange with my phone. I had it plugged in on the counter, but the battery percentage was dropping instead of rising. The charging cable had a small cut near the connector, like it had been sliced open with something sharp. I didn't remember it being like that when I got there. When the sun started setting, I closed all the windows. The air grew still again, heavy, almost hard to breathe. I sat on the couch for hours, waiting for morning, not even trying to sleep. At some point during the night, maybe around 1 a.m., I heard a different sound. Not steps. It was a dragging sound. Long, slow scraping along the deck, like something heavy being pulled across the wood. I sat completely still, staring at the dark outline of the window. The sound stopped after a while, replaced by faint dripping, like water hitting the boards. When the first light came, I went outside. The deck had a dark wet patch near the steps. It wasn't water. It was something thicker, brownish, sticky. It smelled faintly of rust and earth. I followed the marks down the steps and saw the faint trail leading to the lake. The footprints were there again, pressed deep into the mud, ending at the waterline. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. It didn't make sense. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything else. I packed my things quickly after that. I didn't even make breakfast. When I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin sat there quiet and still, the lake flat and calm behind it. Later that afternoon, when I got a signal again, I opened the Airbnb app to report what happened. The listing was gone, just like it had never existed. No photos, no host profile, nothing. I checked my email for the receipt, and even that had vanished. It was like the booking had been erased completely. A few weeks later, I tried to find the road again on Google Maps. The highway was there, but the small turnoff for the gravel road wasn't. It just showed continuous forest. I even checked satellite view, but the lake wasn't visible at all. I don't know what that place was or who had been out there at night, but I know what I saw and heard. Those prints, that dragging sound, the smell on the deck. It was real. For a long time afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the creaking of wood, the slow sound of steps outside a wall. Even now, years later, when I stay somewhere new, the first thing I do is check the windows, the ground outside, and the locks twice. Because the scariest part of it all wasn't what I saw. It was the feeling that whoever was there had been doing this for a long time, waiting for people like me to show up, people who wouldn't be missed for a few days. And when I think about that dragging sound going toward the lake, I can't help but wonder what was under that calm, quiet water, and how many others might have heard the same sounds before they never left. I rented an Airbnb in the middle of rural Tennessee last summer, hoping to get away for a week to write, hike, and just clear my head. The place looked simple but charming. A 1-bedroom cabin with a deck overlooking a small valley, surrounded by thick woods. The listing said it was about 20 minutes from the nearest grocery store, and the photos showed a small gravel driveway and a fire pit out back. I liked the idea of being alone for a while. No traffic, no neighbors, no constant noise. The drive out there was quiet. Once I got off the main highway, the road narrowed into winding lanes through endless trees. My cell signal dropped out about halfway there. When I finally reached the turnoff, it was just a dirt track that curved up a hill. The cabin sat at the top, small and weathered but well kept. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. Felt good at first, peaceful, calm, the kind of silence you don't get in a city. When I went inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The floors creaked a little under my boots. There were large windows looking out over the valley, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. The host had left a handwritten note on the counter, thanking me for staying and reminding me to keep the doors locked at night. It wasn't written in a threatening way, just practical. Still, it stuck in my mind. I unpacked, made coffee, and walked around the property for a bit. The woods behind the cabin were dense, full of tall trees and undergrowth, and I noticed small trails branching off in a few directions. They looked well used, but the listing hadn't mentioned any hiking trails on the property. I figured they were probably just paths animals made or maybe old logging roads. The first night went by fine. It rained lightly, and I slept well to the sound of it hitting the roof. I woke up once in the middle of the night, though, to a faint thump somewhere outside. It didn't sound close, maybe from down near the woods. I waited a minute, then heard it again. A single dull hit, like something heavy landing in the dirt. I told myself it was a branch falling. That made sense. I went back to sleep. The next day, I went into town for groceries and came back around mid-afternoon. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the dirt beside the porch steps. Not mine. They were smaller, narrower, and looked fairly recent because the edges hadn't softened from the rain. They led up to the steps and stopped at the door. My stomach sank for a second, but when I checked the door, it was still locked. Nothing inside seemed out of place. I decided maybe it was the host or someone checking the property after the rain. I didn't overthink it, but I made sure to lock the door again after unpacking. That night was still and quiet. No wind, no rain, just a deep silence broken only by insects and the occasional tree cracking in the distance. I sat on the porch for a while before bed, looking out into the dark woods. You couldn't see much past a few yards. The trees swallowed the light. Around 11 p.m., I turned in, tired from the day. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the air felt colder than before. I remember lying there, half asleep, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, faint movement, like the soft crunch of dirt just outside the bedroom window. My body tensed immediately. The sound was slow, cautious. I stared toward the window, barely breathing. After a few seconds, it stopped. I waited, my heart beating so hard I could hear it. Then came another faint noise, the sound of something brushing against the side of the house, like a hand or a sleeve. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the sound was too controlled. It didn't move away. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, though it was probably 10 minutes. Eventually, it went quiet again. I didn't move until the faint gray light of dawn started seeping through the blinds. When I finally got up, I checked outside. The ground below the window had marks. Not deep footprints, but scuffed areas in the dirt where something had stood. The rest of the day felt strange. I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there. I checked all the locks again. I even looked around the back of the cabin, which I hadn't done before. That's when I noticed something else. The small trails leading into the woods looked more worn than I remembered. One in particular had a few broken branches and what looked like a patch of recently disturbed soil. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I didn't call anyone. I tried to distract myself, made lunch, read for a bit, and sat outside again that evening. But as the sun went down, the woods took on that heavy, suffocating quiet again. It was so still it made my skin prickle. I couldn't hear wind, birds, or anything else. When I went to bed that night, I left a small lamp on in the living room, hoping it might make me feel less uneasy. It didn't help much. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. to a sound that froze me in place, the faint creak of the front porch boards. It was slow, steady. Someone was walking across it, one step at a time. Then the steps stopped right near the door. I could hear the faint shift of weight, like someone standing there. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a long time. Then, a new sound, the soft rattle of the doorknob. Just once. Not rough or loud, just a light test. The kind of way someone might try a handle quietly to see if it would turn. My whole body felt numb. I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to happen again. Didn't. After a few seconds, there was silence. Then the sound of slow footsteps moving away across the porch. I stayed awake until the first light of morning. When I checked outside, the dirt by the porch had clearer prints this time. Bare feet. Small, narrow, maybe a woman's or a teenager's. The doorknob had faint smudge marks, like someone with dirty hands had touched it. My hands shook as I locked it again, even though it was already locked. That morning, I packed up most of my things. I didn't care that I had paid for the week. I just wanted out. Before leaving, I took one last look around. I walked behind the cabin again, toward where that one trail started. I followed it maybe 50 feet before stopping. There was a small clearing there, and at the edge of it, I saw a few things that made me back away fast. An old lawn chair, a rusted metal can, and what looked like an old sleeping bag half buried under leaves. It didn't look new. It looked like it had been used a long time ago but not abandoned. There were footprints around it and a few newer items, a half-empty plastic bottle, a crumpled pack of cigarettes. I turned around and walked straight back to my car. I didn't run, but I didn't look back either. I drove until I hit the main highway and didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I sat there for a while trying to make sense of it. Later, I emailed the host, just to let them know someone might be trespassing near their property. They replied hours later, thanking me but saying they'd had a few similar reports before, and that it was just local kids passing through. That was all they said. I never went back to check. A few weeks later, I looked at the listing again out of curiosity. It was still up. New photos, same description, but the latest review caught my attention. Someone mentioned that they'd woken up one night to find the front porch light turned off, even though they had left it on when they went to bed. They said they'd also found small barefoot prints in the dirt near the steps. I didn't leave a review of my own. I figured it wouldn't matter. Maybe it really was local kids. Maybe someone was just using the woods as a place to sleep and watch the empty house when no one was around. But what still unsettles me now, months later, is how quiet that place was. How whoever it was could walk right up to the door in the middle of the night without making a sound except for a single creak of the boards. I think about that sometimes. The idea that I wasn't really alone, that someone could have been out there the entire time, just waiting in the trees, watching the windows, moving through the dark while I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. I stayed in an Airbnb once that still sticks with me, even though nothing outright violent or supernatural happened. It was just one of those places that slowly gets under your skin the longer you stay. I had been traveling alone through Virginia, just taking time off from work, moving from one small town to another, staying in remote rentals. The next one on my list was a small house just outside a town that barely had a gas station. It was listed as a quiet countryside escape, with 3 acres of woods behind it and a small gravel road that connected it to the main road. The pictures made it look peaceful. Old wooden floors, white curtains, a big porch. The reviews mentioned how quiet it was and how the host kept the place spotless. A few people did mention the host's very specific rules, but I didn't pay much attention to that at first. I figured it was just people being picky. When I arrived, it was early afternoon. The air was warm and still, the woods behind the house thick and dark green. The nearest neighbor was far enough that I couldn't even see their roof. The place smelled faintly of pine and cleaning supplies when I stepped inside. It was neat, almost too neat. Every chair was aligned perfectly under the table, the bedspread smooth and centered. Every curtain tied up the same way. There was a laminated list of house rules on the counter. It was longer than I expected. No shoes in the house, no cooking after 8 p.m., no lights left on overnight, no rearranging of furniture, no opening of certain drawers or cabinets marked with blue tape. That part struck me as a little strange, but I figured maybe the host kept personal things there. The first evening was calm. I unpacked a few things, sat on the porch, listened to the wind moving through the trees. It was quiet enough that you could hear the insects changing rhythm as the sun went down. After dark, though, I started noticing how every little sound carried inside that house. The floors creaked with each step, and sometimes even when I didn't move, I'd hear a light pop from the woods somewhere deeper in the house. I tried not to let it bother me. I watched a movie on my laptop, then went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't from a dream, just that sudden awareness that something had changed in the air. The silence was heavier. I lay there for a few minutes, waiting, trying to figure out what I was hearing. Then I realized it was a faint scratching sound. It came from inside the wall near the head of the bed. At first, I thought it might be mice, but it moved in a way that felt off. A slow, irregular drag, then silence, then a couple of sharp ticks like something tapping. I told myself it was probably an animal. It stopped after a while, but it was enough to keep me half awake the rest of the night. In the morning, the house looked normal again. I made coffee, walked out back, and sat for a while. The woods behind the property looked endless, the kind of dense forest that feels untouched. I could hear water somewhere far off, maybe a stream or a small river. The air was crisp, and the place looked beautiful in daylight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the house was off. When I came back inside, I noticed the blanket on the couch was folded differently than I remembered. I was sure I had left it draped over the armrest, but now it was folded neatly and centered. Could have been me not remembering, but the way it was arranged looked deliberate. Later, when I went to wash my mug, I found that the sponge was moved to the other side of the sink. Small things, but each one added a little more weight to the uneasiness. That night, I followed all the host's rules exactly. I didn't want to give any reason for them to complain or message me. I even checked that all the windows were locked, though one of them in the spare room wouldn't latch properly. I noticed a faint smell when I passed that room. Something sour, like damp wood or old food. I opened the window a little to air it out, then closed the door. Later, when I went to bed, I started hearing noises again. This time it wasn't scratching, it was faint movement, like someone slowly walking across the floor somewhere else in the house. I froze, listening. It wasn't rhythmic like a building settling. It sounded like weight shifting, steps being taken carefully, spaced apart. I held my breath and waited for it to stop. After a few minutes, it did. I didn't move for a long time after that. The next morning, I checked every door and window again. Everything was locked. Nothing looked out of place except for one thing, the blue tape drawer under the kitchen counter. The tape was peeled halfway off, the edge curled up like someone had tried to open it. I hadn't touched it. My stomach tightened when I saw that, but I pushed it down and told myself maybe the adhesive just loosened overnight. Still, I didn't touch it. By the third night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft thump from the spare room, then what sounded like a breath. Not clear or loud, but just enough to make me sit up straight in bed. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker. I turned on my phone flashlight and stared at the door, half expecting it to move. Didn't, but I noticed something else. The smell from that spare room was stronger now, even with the door closed. I got up slowly and checked the window again. The latch I'd tried to close before was open wider. The curtain moved slightly, as if someone had brushed past it. I stepped back and just stood there, my heart beating so fast it hurt. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I made up my mind to leave early. I packed my things as quickly as I could. Before I left, I looked around one last time. That's when I noticed one more thing. Near the back door, there were faint marks on the inside of the frame. Scratches, vertical, close together, about waist height, like someone had been trying to pry the door open quietly. I left the key on the counter, got in my car, and drove off without looking back. I stopped at a gas station a few miles away to calm down. When I checked my phone later, there was already a message from the host asking why I had checked out early. I didn't respond. I didn't even leave a review. A few days later, out of curiosity, I checked the Airbnb listing again. It was still there, same pictures, same rules, same glowing reviews. But a new one had just been added from another guest who had stayed right after me. It said the house was spotless and peaceful, but they mentioned something small, that they kept hearing faint footsteps upstairs, even though the place was all one level. I stared at that review for a long time. I realized whatever had been going on there probably wasn't just my imagination. Maybe it was the host checking up on guests without them knowing, or maybe someone was using one of those locked spaces to come and go quietly. The house wasn't haunted. It was just being watched, controlled in ways that were hidden under all those rules and that perfect order. That's the part that still unsettles me the most. How something can look so normal on the surface but feel so wrong once you're inside. I think about that spare room sometimes, the half-open window, the smell, the sound of careful steps moving in the dark. And I keep wondering how many people stayed there before me and just convinced themselves it was nothing. I started a small podcast a couple of years ago about travel stories, mostly about unusual or unsettling experiences people have while staying in unfamiliar places. What began as lighthearted stories about bad Wi-Fi, broken beds, or strange hosts slowly changed into something darker over time. The more episodes I made, the more people started sending me their experiences, especially those who had stayed alone in remote Airbnbs. I didn't realize how many stories there were like that. Quiet, isolated rentals that seemed peaceful at first, then turned into something much more disturbing. I remember compiling several of them into one episode, each one connected by the same unease, the same creeping feeling that something wasn't right. The first story came from a woman who rented a small guest house outside of Asheville, North Carolina. She had booked it for a week while she worked remotely. The listing had looked perfect. A clean, modern cabin with a small deck overlooking the woods. The host had messaged her several times before her stay, always polite but oddly persistent about when she would arrive and when she planned to leave each day. She brushed it off as someone being overly attentive. But during her stay, she began noticing small, strange details, like how the back door would be unlocked in the morning, even though she remembered locking it the night before. Once she found the living room lamp turned on when she came back from a hike. Another time, her toiletries were rearranged slightly, nothing missing, just moved. The weirdest part was the noise. Every night around 2 or 3 a.m., she'd wake up to the sound of faint footsteps coming from somewhere inside the walls or ceiling. The host told her in a message that the cabin sometimes settled loudly due to the temperature changes, but she said it didn't sound like wood expanding. It sounded like slow, careful steps. She ended up cutting her stay short after 4 days. When she told me the story for the podcast, she said it wasn't one big moment that scared her. It was the slow build-up, realizing she could never fully relax because something in that house didn't match what she'd been told. Another story came from a man who stayed in Utah while driving cross-country. His Airbnb was a converted basement apartment below the host's home. He said the host was friendly, maybe a little too friendly, always trying to talk when he came or went. He didn't think much of it until the second night when he woke up to the sound of someone walking above him. That wasn't unusual. It was the host's home after all. But then he heard a click, like the lock on his side of the door being tested. He froze in bed, staring at the faint line of light coming from under the door. The sound stopped, but he couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, he noticed the lock on the inside of the basement door had been turned halfway, as if someone had tried it from the other side. He said nothing happened after that, but he left a day early. He told me he hadn't been scared in the usual way, just unsettled by the thought that someone had been standing there, maybe just curious, maybe checking if he was awake. Then there was a story from a woman who rented an Airbnb in northern Vermont. The host didn't live on site. The listing had said it was a fully private cabin, with self-check-in and no shared spaces. She was looking forward to total solitude, something quiet to reset after a stressful year. The cabin itself was small but beautiful, surrounded by trees on all sides. The first day was peaceful. She unpacked, went for a walk, and sat by the fire pit until dark. But that night, around 11 p.m., she heard faint scraping sounds outside one of the windows. She thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too high up. It wasn't claws on wood. It was something hard sliding slowly along the glass. She turned off the lights and stayed still, listening. The scraping stopped, but later, she heard what she described as a breathing rhythm outside, faint but steady, like someone standing close to the wall. The next morning, she found faint smudges on the window, like someone had pressed a palm there. She didn't see any footprints in the dirt though, and she convinced herself it had been condensation or tree branches. But over the next 2 days, she found other odd signs. A chair on the porch moved slightly, her shoes repositioned by the door, and once, the bathroom mirror was fogged even though she hadn't used the shower. When she finally left, she said the host messaged her later asking if she had enjoyed the stay. The host mentioned that a previous guest had complained about noises from the woods, but that they were likely raccoons. She never replied to that message. When I was editing the episode, I realized every one of these stories had the same thread. Solo travelers, isolated, noticing things that didn't seem threatening at first but became impossible to ignore. A man who stayed in a farmhouse in Kentucky told me about locked interior doors that rattled faintly at night, like someone trying to open them from the other side. He said he eventually noticed that the old door hinges had fresh screws, like they had been removed and replaced recently. Another woman who stayed in a studio apartment in Oregon mentioned how her clothes were slightly damp each morning even though the windows were shut. She discovered later that the landlord lived next door and had a master key for maintenance. She didn't think much of it until she realized things in her suitcase had been moved around each day. I had gathered over a dozen stories like these. Different locations, different details, but the same unease. The same sense that staying in someone else's property alone meant giving up control in small but real ways. When I was recording the episode, I started to notice how tense I felt, even though I'd heard these stories a dozen times by then. To make the episode feel authentic, I decided to rent an Airbnb myself for the weekend, just a quiet place to record the narration. I booked a small cabin 2 hours away from where I lived. It was a detached guest house behind the host's main home, but separated enough by trees that it felt private. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my microphone and laptop, went over my notes, and took a walk in the afternoon. The property was beautiful. A gravel driveway, tall trees, and nothing but forest behind the house. The quiet was exactly what I wanted. But that night, while I was recording, I kept hearing noises from the main house. It was normal, I told myself, people walking, closing doors. But then, past midnight, I heard something else. A faint knock from behind the bathroom wall. Just one, then another, spaced apart, slow and hollow. I paused the recording and listened. It stopped completely when I stood up. Later that night, I noticed my bag was open. I was sure I had zipped it earlier. My phone charger was on the floor, and one of the drawers in the kitchenette was pulled out a few inches. It wasn't enough to seem like a break-in, but it didn't make sense either. The next morning, I checked my car, thinking maybe I was just paranoid. But when I went outside, I saw a second set of footprints in the damp dirt leading up to the back steps. Not mine. They were smaller and the tread was different. That's when everything I'd heard from others started looping in my head. All those stories about strange noises, quiet movements, unlocked doors, rearranged belongings. I had treated them as stories, just content for the show, but now it felt real. I didn't stay another night. I packed up and left that afternoon, no explanation. I finished the episode back home, sitting in my living room with all the lights on. When the episode came out, it became one of the most listened to ones I'd ever made. People sent even more stories afterward, dozens of them. Some sounded like coincidences, others like patterns. It made me realize something that I hadn't really thought about before. When you stay in an Airbnb, especially alone, you're not really alone. You're in a stranger's space, surrounded by things they own, under locks they control. You trust that the cameras are off, the doors are private, and the host isn't nearby. But trust doesn't mean safety. And after listening to all those stories and living one myself, I stopped renting private Airbnbs altogether. Now I stick to hotels. I sleep better knowing there's someone at the front desk, cameras in the hall, and doors that only open from the inside. The episode ended up being about isolation, not just being alone, but realizing that maybe you never really are. I rented a small Airbnb cabin in Troutdale, Virginia for a weekend alone last fall. I had been looking forward to some quiet time away from everything. No work, no people, no noise. The listing had said it was a one-room log cabin tucked into the woods, about half an hour from the nearest town. It looked perfect in the pictures, a little wooden porch, a view of the trees, and a small creek that ran behind it. I imagined I'd spend my days reading, hiking a bit, and just resting. When I arrived, it was exactly what I had hoped for. The drive itself felt endless, winding through miles of forest roads and narrow gravel paths. But once I saw the cabin, it felt worth it. It was simple but well kept, with siding, a small fire pit, a couple of old chairs on the porch. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the running water from the creek nearby. Inside, the place was small but clean. A bed, a table, a small kitchen counter with a few basics. The kind of quiet that fills your ears and makes you realize how used you are to background noise. I unloaded my bag, made some coffee, and sat outside for a long time just listening to the woods. The first day passed peacefully. I took a walk down the dirt road, took pictures of the leaves, cooked a simple dinner, and went to bed early. The bed was firm, and the windows were the kind that didn't quite seal shut, so you could hear every bit of wind and movement outside. But I liked it. It felt raw and real, just me and the woods. The first strange thing happened the next night. I was sitting outside on the porch around dusk, reading with a small lantern next to me. The air had cooled off and the woods had gone quiet in that strange, sudden way they do before night. I heard footsteps, clear, slow, deliberate ones, coming from the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a deer. The ground was covered with leaves, and every step made a faint crunch. But after a few seconds, it sounded too controlled, too heavy. I turned off the lantern and sat still. The footsteps stopped too. I waited a full minute, barely breathing. Then, from the other side of the cabin, I heard a soft snap, like a branch breaking. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was an animal again. Maybe something circling, curious about the smell of food. I waited another minute, then stood up and went inside. I locked the door, turned on the light, and sat on the edge of the bed. The woods stayed quiet after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching. I stayed up late that night, scrolling on my phone just to distract myself. Every creak in the cabin made me tense up. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. The next morning felt normal again. Bright sunlight, cold air, everything calm. I almost laughed at myself, thinking I had just overreacted. I spent the day hiking along a small trail that ran parallel to the creek. When I got back that afternoon, I noticed something that made me stop. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the side of the cabin. They were faint but clear enough to see they weren't mine. They looked like boot prints, maybe size 10 or 11, pressed into the ground leading toward the back of the cabin. I stood there for a while just looking at them. The soil was still a little damp from the rain the night before, so they had to be fresh. I told myself maybe the host had stopped by for maintenance or to check something, though there was no reason for them to come out there unannounced. Still, I tried not to dwell on it. That evening, it started getting dark earlier. The cabin didn't have curtains thick enough to block the outside completely, so the windows showed reflections of the room mixed with faint movement from the trees outside. Around 9 p.m., I started hearing noises again. Not loud, but enough to make me freeze. It was the sound of something brushing against the wall. Then a dull thump, like a soft hit near the back door. I stayed completely still. The sound came again, a few inches away from the first spot. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stood near the window, not sure what I was even planning to do. I waited until everything went silent, then flashed the light outside through the glass. The beam cut through the dark trees, but I didn't see anything. The woods looked empty. I turned off the light, trying to convince myself it was just branches or an animal bumping into the wall. I lay down on the bed, but my body wouldn't relax. It felt like the silence itself was too thick, pressing in on all sides. A little after midnight, I woke up again. The cabin was pitch black except for the faint gray outline of the window. I didn't move for a while because I thought I heard breathing. Not mine, something deeper, slower. It was faint, but I could hear it from the direction of the porch. It stopped when I shifted. Then I heard one quick step on the porch boards, the creak of weight pressing down on the old wood. Every hair on my body stood up. I grabbed my phone and opened the flashlight again. I aimed it toward the front window, but the glass was too fogged to see clearly. I stood there for minutes, just waiting, trying to hear anything else. The breathing didn't return, but I could hear something moving faintly through the leaves, slow, dragging steps moving away toward the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sun came up, I went outside. The boards on the porch had fresh marks, small dirt smudges, maybe from boots or shoes. I followed them around to the side of the cabin, and they stopped near the corner where the trees started. The ground was disturbed there too, like someone had stood watching for a long time. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my things, threw everything into the car, and sat for a while with the engine running, trying to process what had happened. I checked my phone for service. There was barely a bar, but enough to send a message to the host saying I was leaving early because of an emergency. I didn't go into details. The drive back down the forest road felt longer than before. Every bend in the path made me glance in the mirrors. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone until I reached the main road. When I got home, I kept thinking about it. The footsteps, the breathing, the marks on the porch. None of it felt random. A few days later, I looked up Troutdale online and found that there had been a few reports over the years of people seeing squatters in those remote cabins, or hunters camping illegally near private land. It made sense. Someone had probably been living rough in those woods, watching the place, waiting for an easy moment to check what was inside. It explained the sounds, the feeling of being observed, even the strange patience of whoever it was walking around the cabin. They probably didn't mean to harm me, maybe just looking for food, or curious who had shown up in their usual spot. But being out there alone, miles from anyone, knowing that someone was close enough to listen to me breathe through those thin walls, that thought still sits heavy in my chest. What scared me most wasn't the idea of ghosts or anything supernatural. It was knowing that it was real, that someone had been there, that while I sat reading on the porch or tried to sleep, someone was standing just far enough into the trees to see me clearly, and I never saw them at all. I still travel sometimes, but I don't rent remote cabins anymore. No matter how peaceful the pictures look, I can't enjoy the silence the same way. Silence feels different when you know it can hide someone. I stayed at an Airbnb with my grandparents last summer, deep in a quiet part of northern Michigan. It was a big, old house surrounded by trees, tucked away from the main road. The listing had shown pictures of a cozy living room, a few clean bedrooms, and a big deck overlooking the woods. It looked peaceful. My grandparents wanted to visit the lakes nearby, and I figured it would be a calm weekend away from everything. We got there late in the afternoon after a long drive. The place looked older than in the pictures. The paint was faded, and the air inside smelled faintly of damp wood, like the house hadn't been opened up in a while. But everything was tidy. The host had left a little note on the counter, saying there were fresh sheets and that the fans might be loud at night because of the humidity. My grandparents took the main room downstairs, and I got the upstairs one facing the backyard. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. You could hear every little sound, the ticking of a clock in the living room, the old pipes creaking, the floorboard stretching when someone walked. The air felt still, and the woods outside seemed heavier than they looked from the car. I remember sitting on the bed that evening, watching the light fade behind the blinds, and thinking how far away everything felt. No cars, no voices, just wind moving through the trees. We had dinner and went to bed early. I kept my phone charging on the small table beside the bed. The bed was soft but had that slightly musty smell that old houses always have. I scrolled through my phone for a while, then turned off the lamp and listened to the faint hum of the ceiling fan. It was one of those nights where sleep doesn't come easy, even though you're tired. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. No noise, no reason. I just opened my eyes and knew something felt wrong. The kind of wrong you can't explain, only feel. The air felt thick and heavy, like the oxygen had been drained out of the room. My heart was already beating fast, though I hadn't moved yet. There was a low hum in my ears, the sound you hear when blood rushes too quickly. I tried to take a slow breath, but it came out shaky. That's when I noticed something strange about my body. My lips were numb, like I had been outside in the cold for too long. Then, a sharp, prickly feeling started spreading across my skin, thousands of tiny needles poking at once. It wasn't just an itch or a tingle. It was sharp, deep, and spreading fast, from my legs to my arms and chest. My muscles tensed on their own, and I felt a sudden rush of panic because I couldn't tell what was happening. I thought maybe I was having some kind of allergic reaction, though nothing made sense. I hadn't eaten anything unusual. I tried to sit up, but even that felt hard. My limbs felt heavy and weak, and the more I tried to move, the more the prickling sensation grew. The air smelled different too, almost metallic, like iron or old blood. My tongue felt thick in my mouth. I looked toward the window because that's where the faint light was coming from. The blinds were closed, but the moonlight slipped through the edges, throwing pale lines across the floor. For a few seconds, I thought I saw movement, a shift in the shadows. I blinked hard, thinking it was just my eyes adjusting. But when I looked again, there was something there. It was standing right in front of the blinds. I could see it clearly enough in the dim light, the outline of a torso, shoulders, arms, and legs. No head, just a human-shaped figure, neck up missing, standing still and perfectly upright. I couldn't hear breathing, couldn't hear movement, but I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. It was blocking part of the blinds, and the light lines bent around it. Every muscle in my body froze. I didn't move, didn't blink. I just stared. My brain was screaming to get up, to shout, to run downstairs, but my body wouldn't obey. The tingling on my skin got worse. I could feel sweat forming along my back even though the air was cool. The figure didn't move an inch. It was like it was watching even without a head to do so. I don't know how long I lay there. Minutes, maybe an hour. My eyes started watering from trying not to blink. The shadow stayed exactly the same, still and tall. The ceiling fan clicked faintly above me, and that was the only sound. I thought maybe I was hallucinating, maybe the fan or the blinds were creating the shape, but it didn't flicker or fade. It was solid, real. At some point, I realized my breathing had slowed. The numbness in my lips faded a little, and the sharp needle feeling softened to a dull buzz. I forced myself to move one finger, then another. My hand shook as I reached for my phone on the table. I wanted to turn on the flashlight, but I was scared of what it would show. The idea of seeing that thing clearly made me sick to my stomach. I kept my eyes on it while I pulled the blanket higher. I told myself over and over that it had to be something logical. Maybe a coat hanging wrong. Maybe the curtain folded oddly. I clung to that thought, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The shape was too distinct, too human. I stayed awake like that until the first thin light of morning started bleeding through the window. When the room finally began to brighten, I dared to blink. The shape was gone. The space in front of the blinds was empty. My muscles were cramped and sore from how tense I had been. As soon as I could move properly, I got out of bed. My legs were unsteady. I went straight to the window and pulled the blinds up. Outside, the yard looked normal wet grass, mist still clinging to the trees. Inside, there was nothing that could have made that shape. No furniture, no hanging clothes, no tricks of light, just empty space. When my grandparents got up, I didn't say anything. I felt stupid even thinking about it. I spent the morning outside on the deck, trying to shake off that feeling of dread, but it didn't go away. My skin still buzzed faintly, and my lips tingled off and on. That afternoon, I noticed something else strange. The carbon monoxide detector in the hallway had been unplugged. It was just sitting there on the floor under the outlet. I plugged it back in, and after a few minutes, it started beeping, a high-pitched, constant sound. I unplugged it again immediately. I didn't say anything until later, when my grandparents mentioned they'd felt lightheaded during the night too, but thought it was just the altitude or the long drive. That's when it hit me what might have happened. The symptoms, the numb lips, the tingling skin, the heavy limbs, the confusion, they all matched carbon monoxide exposure. It explained the dread too, that intense panic that came out of nowhere, the feeling of pressure in the chest. My body had been reacting to a lack of oxygen, not fear. The shadow figure, that was probably just my mind filling in the blanks while half-conscious and hypoxic, trying to make sense of the shapes in the dark. We left that same day. My grandfather told the host about the detector issue, and they apologized, said a previous guest must have unplugged it. But I knew that if I hadn't woken up when I did, things could have gone a lot worse. Even now, months later, I still remember how real that shadow looked, how still it stood, headless, at the window. It's strange how the mind can build something so solid out of fear and oxygen loss. But the body doesn't care what's real or not when it's starving for air. It just tries to survive. That night taught me how close a simple thing, like a loose plug, can bring you to the edge without you even knowing it. And whenever I stay somewhere new now, no matter how clean or peaceful it looks, the first thing I do is check the detectors and open a window before I sleep.